Every nation has a government, but only one system controls them all: the global network of central banks and the IMF. In 1944, 44 countries signed away part of their economic freedom in exchange for stability. However, by the 2000s, that stability turned into silent control. So when crises hit, who really gives the orders? Hey, I'm Nate Ledger, and this story begins in a place few ever look: inside the rooms where money itself was redesigned. What if I told you that the system running every paycheck, every loan, and every crash wasn't born by law or vote, but by panic and private deals? In 1907, New York's entire banking system nearly fell apart. Stocks collapsed by 50%, banks shut their doors, and crowds shouted outside Wall Street. There was no Federal Reserve, no safety net, only chaos. One man stepped forward: J.P. Morgan, already one of the richest in America. He gathered the country's top bankers inside his personal library and told them straight: either they pool their money and save the system tonight, or tomorrow the country breaks. They followed his lead. Millions in emergency cash flooded the markets overnight. The panic ended. And just like that, one man had proven something shocking. Private power could stop a national collapse faster than any government. Therefore, a question spread through Washington: what if the next crisis didn't have a Morgan? 6 years later, in 1913, they built a permanent fix: the Federal Reserve. On paper, it was national. In reality, it was a network of private banks acting as one. 12 regional banks tied by one central board. And for the first time, a small, unelected group could decide when the economy should rise or fall. But that idea of money controlled through coordination didn't stay American. In 1930, Europe copied it. They built the Bank for International Settlements, or BIS, in Basel, Switzerland, the first central bank for central banks. It looked harmless, but it quietly connected every major economy through one institution. Even during World War II, it handled transactions for both Allied and Axis powers. Think about that. While soldiers fought, bankers still settled accounts in the same room. So the BIS survived every war, every regime, and every ideology, because the world needed a neutral place for money to move, even when politics collapsed. And that's where this hidden story truly begins. With a network that was never elected, yet somehow outlived every government it served. Now we move to the moment this club dropped its mask and became a global authority, forged in war, backed by gold, and led by promises that would change everything. The world had just survived 2 world wars, but peace came with a price: massive debt, broken currencies, and starving nations. Europe was in ruins, Asia was drained, and the United States suddenly owned most of the world's gold. By 1950, America controlled more than 70% of all official reserves on Earth. That kind of imbalance could break any system. So in 1944, before the war even ended, world leaders met in a small resort town called Bretton Woods in New Hampshire. 44 countries sent delegates. They didn't meet to talk peace. They met to rebuild power. What came out of that meeting changed everything. The plan was simple but bold. The US dollar would become the center of the new world economy, tied directly to gold at $35 an ounce. Other currencies would link to the dollar. If one country's money collapsed, they could borrow from a new institution, the International Monetary Fund, or IMF. And to fund major rebuilding projects, they created another body, the World Bank. Therefore, the global financial map shifted overnight. Nations handed over parts of their economic control to these new institutions in exchange for stability. Sounded fair, but power always hides in the details. Within 10 years, the US dollar became more than a currency. It became a weapon. Countries that borrowed from the IMF had to follow its economic rules. Governments that disobeyed risked being cut off from credit or trade. By the 1960s, the IMF and World Bank were deciding how much nations could spend, what they could tax, and even what they could import. However, gold had its limits. As America printed more dollars to fund wars and expansion, the metal that backed those dollars couldn't keep up. That tension grew quietly for years until one single speech in 1971 flipped the entire global system. And from that moment, money stopped being metal. It became faith. By the early 1970s, the world was drowning in paper promises. Countries trusted the dollar because it was tied to gold, but America had been printing far more dollars than it had metal to back them. Wars in Vietnam, spending at home, foreign aid, the bills piled up. Nations started demanding gold in exchange for their dollars, and the U.S. vaults were shrinking fast. Then came August 15, 1971. President Richard Nixon appeared on television and announced that the U.S. would temporarily suspend the dollar's link to gold. That one sentence quietly ended the Bretton Woods system and changed money forever. From that day forward, the dollar wasn't backed by gold. It was backed by trust. Therefore, money became what governments said it was. Currencies began to float against each other, and the value of money turned into a matter of belief and confidence, not metal. But who decides belief? Who measures trust? That's where the IMF and the World Bank found new power. During the 1970s and 1980s, dozens of countries in Latin America, Africa, and Asia fell into debt traps. Oil shocks hit, inflation soared, and nations ran out of reserves. The IMF stepped in with loans, but each loan came with strings. Governments had to cut spending, privatize industries, and open their markets to foreign investors. By 1982, IMF lending had reached $35 billion a year. Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina all fell under its programs. In exchange for help, their economies were reshaped to match Western models. Many saw recovery. Others called it economic surrender. However, the real shift came quietly. Global finance had now replaced gold with policy. The BIS coordinated between central banks, the IMF controlled national budgets, and the World Bank funded the infrastructure to make it all work. Money had become a managed illusion, and control moved further from citizens and closer to a few unelected boards. Every crisis since then followed the same script: panic, rescue, and reform. But who really benefits when the rescuers also write the rules? The next chapter reveals how every crash that shook the planet somehow strengthened the same small circle that claims to protect it. Every time the world economy shakes, the same players step forward: the IMF, the central banks, and the BIS. They move fast, speak calmly, and promise stability. But the strange part is this: after every rescue, they come out stronger. In 1997, Asia's booming economies, Thailand, Indonesia, South Korea, suddenly collapsed. Currencies fell by half in weeks. Stock markets lost $600 billion, and millions lost jobs. The IMF rushed in with rescue loans worth $110 billion, but every deal came with demands. Governments had to raise interest rates, cut public spending, and sell their state-owned companies to foreign investors. Within 2 years, over 60 major Asian corporations were bought by Western banks and funds at bargain prices. Therefore, while the headlines spoke of recovery, ownership quietly changed hands. Factories reopened, but under new bosses. Economies bounced back, but local control didn't. Then came 2008, a year that tested everything. The global financial system froze after decades of easy money and risky bets. Trillions in derivatives, paper bets tied to real homes, began to explode. The Federal Reserve opened swap lines with Europe and Japan, providing over $580 billion to keep banks liquid. Central banks coordinated daily, calling it an unprecedented act of cooperation. However, there was a strange pattern again. The same institutions that helped cause the crash, through leverage and cheap credit, now led the recovery. The world's biggest banks were saved, while millions of families lost homes and pensions. Yet no one voted for these policies. They were made behind closed doors, discussed in Basel, Washington, and London. Then came the COVID shock in 2020. Central banks printed over $9 trillion globally to keep markets alive. Stocks recovered faster than wages. Inequality widened. The cycle repeated: crisis, control, calm. So the question keeps returning: are these institutions protecting the system or managing its obedience? Because every time they fix a collapse, their reach grows deeper into currencies, policies, and even politics. And that reach is about to extend into something far more personal: your money in digital form. Money has always been about control, but digital money changes what control means. For decades, cash moved quietly, person to person. It carried no memory, no history, and no owner once it left your hand. Now that world is fading. Around 130 countries are testing central bank digital currencies, or CBDCs, with help from the IMF and the BIS. China already leads the race. Its digital yuan is used by over 260 million people, and every transaction is traceable. Europe is next, preparing the digital euro for release. The US explores a digital dollar through the Federal Reserve's pilot program, while the BIS runs Project Bridge, connecting central banks across Asia and the Middle East. The language sounds technical: efficiency, inclusion, modernization. But under that, the real shift is about power. Therefore, if money becomes fully digital, it also becomes programmable. That means governments or central banks could set how, where, or even when it's spent. Imagine a world where stimulus payments expire if unused, or where certain products trigger spending limits. It sounds like fiction, yet officials already discuss it in public reports. In 2021, BIS General Manager Agustin Carstens said during a panel discussion, "The central bank will have absolute control over the rules and regulations that determine the use of that expression of central bank liability." Few sentences have ever sounded so calm, yet so serious. However, CBDCs also solve real problems: faster payments, cheaper cross-border trade, and fewer fraud risks. They promise a new level of convenience, which is why many people welcome them. But convenience has always been the quiet cousin of control. Once cash disappears, privacy disappears with it. So here we are again. Progress that feels like a gift, but carries a cost. The same institutions that managed crises now prepare to manage behavior too. And the next part of this story asks a harder question. What happens when money, policy, and technology finally merge into one system that answers to no voter? Every country has a written constitution, but the global economy runs on one that nobody ever voted for. Doesn't live in any book or parliament, lives inside the policies of central banks, IMF programs, and Basel agreements. Together, they decide the flow of almost $100 trillion in global liquidity. Think about it. The Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, and the Bank of Japan coordinate interest rates that affect housing prices in Africa and food costs in Asia. When they raise or cut rates, the impact spreads across oceans within seconds. During the COVID crisis, those three central banks injected over $9 trillion in liquidity. Stock markets soared, yet wages lagged. Ordinary workers paid for stability they never agreed to. Therefore, real power today doesn't come from elections. It comes from balance sheets. The BIS, based in Basel, quietly acts as the meeting point for the world's most powerful financial figures. Every 2 months, about 60 central bank governors fly in privately for closed-door sessions. No journalists, no minutes, no votes. Yet the outcomes guide policy for half of the global economy. However, what makes the system even more interesting is how seamlessly it runs. There's no single ruler or conspiracy, it's pure coordination. The IMF enforces fiscal rules, the World Bank funds the infrastructure, and the central banks manage liquidity. Together, they keep the global financial machine running, and through that stability, they gain obedience. Over time, this structure became so normal that most people stopped noticing. Inflation, debt ceilings, or currency swaps feel like background noise, but behind those terms are real choices: who gets credit, who doesn't, who grows, and who falls. So maybe the greatest trick of this financial cartel is how open it is. Everything is public, yet nobody pays attention. The meetings are streamed, the reports published, but the language is so dense that few ever read them. Empires once needed armies and borders. Now they use interest rates and data. And the strange truth is, the most powerful system on Earth no longer hides, simply wears a suit, speaks in statistics, and calls itself stability. Power never disappears, it just changes form. If you've come this far, you already see the pattern. Subscribe, stay curious, and join me